Hi everybody, welcome back. So in this lecture we're going to explore a position called ethical relativism. This will be the first of two meta-ethical theories we're going to take a look at. In the next lecture we're going to take a look at a position called divine command theory and a related view called natural law theory. And those two theories, ethical relativism and divine command theory / natural law theory, will be are examples of meta-ethical theories. And we're going to find it's a little complicated because ethical relativism and divine command theory are both meta-ethical theories and normative ethical theories. And so it's important at the beginning here for us to take a look at the distinction between meta-ethics and normative ethics so we have a clear understanding of the framework where these theories fit. Okay, so let's begin with a basic definition of meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is concerned with questions about the fundamental basis of our ethical claims. So any question you can ask on a foundational level about the nature of morality or our ethical claims would fall under this category of meta-ethics. So when a philosopher is doing meta-ethics, they're not attempting to explain what the correct principles of right and wrong are. That would be normative ethics, and we'll see that here in a second. But instead, what they're trying to do is uncover the nature of the foundations of our moral claims. So they'd be exploring questions like these four I have on the slide. So one would be, are there moral truths? This question is really asking whether or not when we make moral assertions, when we say that something is right or something is wrong, are we asserting something that has truth value, or is it just an expression of an emotion or an empty articulation? So if you could answer that question, you wouldn't be really explaining what's right and what's wrong. What you're doing is explaining the substructure of our moral beliefs. Also, if there are moral truths, what is the origin and nature of those moral truths? In other words, if we say that something is morally right or something is morally wrong, why is it morally right or morally wrong? What made it that way? What was the origin of that moral truth? And so we'll see that both ethical relativism and the position of divine command theory in the next lecture will both try to give answers to that sort of question as to the origin and nature of our moral claims. Third example, are moral truths culturally determined? This is what the ethical relativist is going to hold, which we'll see in more detail here in a second. And so in their view, the source of moral truth is just human beings. We make it up as a culture, we make it up individually, but there are no moral truths until we determine what they are. So for them, they would answer the first two questions by saying, yes, there are moral truths. They are created by us. And two, the origin, once again, is by us, and their nature is it's created by humanity. So then a final question here, are moral truths determined by God? So as opposed to the ethical relativist view, who's going to say that we determine moral truth, there are those who argue that a divine being determines moral truth. And as I said, we'll look at that in our next lecture. Okay, so that should give you a basic idea of what we're talking about when we're using the term meta-ethics. It's those issues, philosophical issues that are below the moral claims themselves. If you have a moral theory, you've articulated what right and wrong are, you can still ask questions about what makes those particular claims the correct particular claims. Okay, so let's move to our next slide, where we're going to explore the nature of normative ethics here. So normative ethics is, in contrast to meta-ethics, concerned with questions about the correct standards of right and wrong. So when a philosopher is doing normative ethics, they're not trying to investigate the foundations of our moral beliefs. They're trying to actually articulate the standards of right and wrong themselves. So when most people use the word ethics, they tend to mean normative ethics. They don't usually mean to refer to issues within the realm of meta-ethics. When most people say, I have an ethical belief, they don't mean something about the foundations of ethics. They usually mean about a given theory of right and wrong. So questions that philosophers might explore within the realm of normative ethics would be questions like, is murder, rape, torture, lying, etc. Morally wrong? Are there exceptions to our moral rules? So if we say that X is wrong, could there be circumstances where we would change our rule and follow some other rule? And then finally, is it morally wrong to be self-concerned? In other words, if I believe that to be a good person is just to look out for myself, is that morally wrong or morally right? So in all of those examples, we're not exploring the foundations of our moral system. We're actually trying to investigate the moral system itself and articulate a clear theory of right and wrong. Okay, so that's the distinction between meta-ethics and normative ethics. And so this first theory we're looking at here, ethical relativism, we're going to find out is both a meta-ethical theory and a normative ethical theory. In other words, it's going to explain to us what the foundations of our moral beliefs are, and it's going to articulate to us what the correct standards of right and wrong are. So it's going to answer questions in both of these areas of inquiry. Okay, so another distinction we need to have clear at the beginning here, and this will be important for us in the next lecture also, is understanding this distinction. And it's the difference between objective ethics and subjective ethics. So if we say a moral truth is objective, what we mean is that it exists independently of what we think or feel. Think of it as out there to be discovered. Now, there are other examples of objective type truths. Most people argue, not everyone, but most people argue that mathematics and physics are good examples of disciplines with objective truths. In other words, the rules of mathematics existed before human beings ever came along. In the time of the dinosaurs, 2 plus 2 equaled 4. It just hadn't been articulated and expressed in some symbolic system. But the logic of that relationship, 2 plus 2 equaling 4, existed prior to our existence. And so when we came along, we had the intellectual capacity to discover such truths, and that's the nature of mathematics, many people argue. Same thing with the laws of physics. The laws of physics existed in the time of the dinosaurs and before, and when we came along, we were able to codify them and put them into a structured mathematical system, but nevertheless, they existed prior to our being on the planet. So there are many people who believe that moral truths are the same. That murder, for example, being morally wrong, was morally wrong before our species ever existed. Before human beings ever walked the planet, murder was just already morally wrong. So that's what it means for a moral truth to be objective. It already exists prior to our existence. It's out there to be discovered in some way. And of course, it's a challenging philosophical question to articulate how one would discover such objective truths, but there are a number of different ways that philosophers have tried to approach that issue. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, a moral truth is subjective if its existence depends on what we think or feel. So what this means is that the moral truth wasn't out there to be discovered before we came along. What happened was that there was no moral truth. We came along and we created that truth. And so it's it's dependent upon us for its existence. So examples of other types of subjective truths would be things like the nature of beauty. This is debated, obviously, but many people believe that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. What makes something beautiful is determined by each individual. So it's not something that exists independently of the individual. The individual determines the nature of beauty itself. And the same thing would be for taste preferences. If you say, I don't really like Indian food, you're just expressing a particular taste preference. There is no fact of the matter whether or not Indian food tastes good or bad. It tastes good to one person and bad to another person. So that would be an example of a subjective type of truth or a subjective type of claim. So those who hold that moral truth is subjective, they're arguing for exactly the same position, that that particular truth just depends on the decision of an individual or a group of individuals. Okay, so that's the distinction between objective ethics and subjective ethics. So now let's look at some clear definitions of ethical relativism itself. So there are two types of ethical relativism. There's one position called subjective ethical relativism, and this claim is that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by individual sentiment. So that means that each individual chooses their own moral code. This is the most extreme form of ethical relativism. So under this view, we are all sort of morally independent. Each of us can create our own unique moral code. And we could all have logically contradictory moral beliefs. I could believe that murder is right, you could believe that murder is morally wrong, and we would all be absolutely justified in holding to those positions because each individual has the autonomy and the ability to create their own set of moral principles. And once they create them, they become true for them as an individual. They wouldn't be true for the other individuals because there are no universally true moral claims under the subjective ethical relativist view. Okay, so that's where you have a single individual, subjective ethical relativism, creating their own unique and personal moral code. So you have this other position called cultural or conventional ethical relativism. And the view here is that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined by cultural sentiment. So when they say cultural sentiment here, they mean a group of people determines what's morally right and morally wrong. So before the group gets together and agrees on the nature of morality, there are no moral truths, and then they come together and form some agreement about the nature of right and wrong, and then there are moral truths moving forward. And of course the group could change their mind and create a completely different moral code. It would just all be contingent upon whether or not they all agreed that that was the nature of morality. So on this view, moral truths are decided collectively by the entire culture. And of course, to fully articulate that theory, you'd have to explain what you mean by culture. Is it 2 people, 3 people, 4 people? Are there other criteria for a group of people to qualify as a culture? But in any case, it's a collective of people determining what moral truth is. Okay, so those are our two positions here, and you can see how they are both of these views, subjective ethical relativism and cultural ethical relativism, are both normative ethical theories and meta-ethical theories. They're obviously normative ethical theories because when a culture or an individual decides what's right and wrong, they are articulating a given set of moral principles. They are saying certain things are morally right and certain things are morally wrong, so they're establishing the norms of moral behavior. But also they have an explanation for the foundations of those moral claims. If we were to ask the ethical relativist of either version, subjective or cultural, if we asked them, what's the origin of your moral truths, they would say they're just made up by people. We either make them up individually or we make them up as a group, but the truths are just created by individuals or groups themselves. So that's what makes ethical relativism both a normative ethical theory and a meta-ethical theory. Okay, so this is philosophy, and so it's one thing to define theories, but we have to have evidence for those theories if we're going to accept them. Now, ethical relativism is an extremely popular theory. If you ask average people on the street, a lot of times they'll subscribe to one version or another of ethical relativism. They'll say things like, we can't judge other cultures for their moral beliefs, essentially saying that the moral beliefs of other cultures and other individuals are just as valid as theirs or any other person's moral beliefs. So it's a very common way of thinking about ethics, but it's one thing to hold that position, it's another thing to actually have evidence for that position. So I want to look at an argument for ethical relativism. This is one that was covered in the reading. I asked you to take a look at the Rachel's reading on ethical relativism. And so I would argue that this cultural differences argument is the most common way you see people who are philosophically untrained arguing for ethical relativism. So I put the argument out here with three premises and a conclusion. The premises are 1, 2, and 3. Those are the statements of evidence. That's what the word premise means. They're evidence offered in favor of a particular claim. And number 4 is the conclusion. That's the claim that's being supported, that ethical relativism is true. So let's try to understand how this argument works. So the first premise says that different cultures and individuals have different moral codes. So this is essentially just an anthropological claim. In other words, we could go to the anthropology department or to anthropological journals, and we could look at numerous examples of where different cultures and individuals have different moral codes. In fact, Rachel's, in the reading I asked you to take a look at, looks at a number of those examples. But you don't have to search very far on the internet to find examples where cultures have vastly different values than ours. For example, in Afghanistan, women are not given access generally to education, and so in our culture we believe that all individuals should have access to an education, and so that's just a simple example of differing moral values from one culture to another. So the first claim is unequivocally, this first premise is unequivocally supported. There's just example after example, it seems, of moral diversity out there, different cultures subscribing to vastly different moral codes. Now we're going to see a way to challenge the first premise later on, but most people think there's quite a bit of evidence in favor of it. So premise 2, this moral diversity implies that there are no objective moral values. So what they're claiming here is that since if we were to travel all around the world and find so many different views about what's right and what's wrong, what that implies is that there are no universal truths about morality that apply to every single individual. Let's take it and apply that same kind of reasoning to mathematics. If I were to go to Afghanistan, we'd find out that they believe that 2 + 2 = 4. If I went to China, we'd find out that they believe that 2 + 2 = 4. If I went to India, they would agree. Every place on the planet where you have rational beings, they would agree on the nature of these mathematical truths. So that's the reason that many people feel that mathematical truths are objective, because everybody holds them to be the case. But when it comes to the nature of right and wrong, when we travel around and look at different cultures, we don't find that same sort of agreement. So what the supporter of this argument is saying is that so much moral diversity implies that there are no objective moral values that exist independently of what we think or feel and are shared universally across various cultures. So that's premise 2. Now 3, the claim is that if there are no objective moral values, then the moral values must be culturally or individually determined. In other words, if there are moral values at all and they can't be objective, then they must be determined by culture or an individual. And so if that's the case, if we accept premise 3, that is equivalent to accepting the position of ethical relativism. So in 4 we conclude, therefore ethical relativism is true. So the cultural differences argument essentially argues that since there's so much disagreement about the nature of morality, it follows that ethical relativism is true. Because if there were universally valid, objective moral truths, they would be held across all these different cultures, and in fact, they're not. Okay. So the question is, does the cultural differences argument actually work? And so, our job here as philosophers is to look at the evidence for these claims and then also look at the critical analysis of the evidence for these claims. And so now let's take a look at critical analysis of the cultural differences argument. Okay, so the first criticism of the cultural differences argument is actually logically devastating. The argument has a fatal logical flaw. We can construct a counterexample argument, and when I say that, what that means is we can construct an argument that has the same basic logical structure as the cultural differences argument, but clearly leads us to a false conclusion. Okay, so here's an example of a counterexample argument that does exactly that. So the first premise, and the only premise here, is that there is disagreement about the shape of the earth. There's this group of people who call themselves flat earthers, and they apparently believe that the earth is flat. I assume that they're serious about these claims. And so, on the other hand, most people believe that the earth is roughly spherical. So the first premise, the premise here is telling us that there is disagreement about the geographical facts of the earth. And so since there's disagreement about the geographical facts of the earth, the supporter of this argument wants to conclude, therefore the earth has no definitive shape. Now, obviously the conclusion is false. The earth has some sort of shape or another. So what this counterexample shows us is that just because people disagree about the shape of the earth, we really can't conclude from that that there is no shape. What we could conclude from that is that people disagree about the shape of the earth. So that means that the premise of this argument is true. People do disagree about the shape of the earth, but the conclusion is obviously false. And if you have an argument where the premise is true and the conclusion is false, that means there's something wrong inferentially. There's something wrong in the reasoning of the argument, and that the premise or premises do not really support the conclusion. And this argument parallels exactly the cultural differences argument, right? If we look at the cultural differences argument, what we find out is that it has the same structure. Notice that the cultural differences argument has the same exact structure as the counterexample that I just gave you, and therefore has the same flaw. So up here in the first premise, we're making a claim about different cultures and individuals having different moral codes, and that moral diversity implies that there are no objective moral values. That's exactly like claiming that there's disagreement about the shape of the earth. And so from the fact that we disagree about the nature of morality, the supporter of the cultural differences argument wants to conclude that ethical relativism is true, when in fact that's unwarranted. The most they can conclude is that people disagree about the nature of morality. They can't conclude that there aren't any universally valid moral truths. All they can do is make various anthropological claims about how people have different moral values. So the cultural differences argument is fundamentally flawed in this way. So even though it's a popular argument and people in everyday life think that it seems like a plausible way of arguing when they say things like, who am I to judge? One culture has their values, I have mine. Therefore, there are no universally valid moral truths. That's just a shorter version of the cultural differences argument. It still suffers from this same flaw. You cannot argue from lack of moral agreement to lack of objectivity when it comes to morality. They just do not follow inferentially. Now, that's not the only problem with the cultural differences argument. There's a second issue here. The first premise is just a claim about how much moral diversity there is out there in the world. There's lots of disagreement about the nature of right and wrong. But what we might find if we explore a little deeper is that there may not be as much moral diversity as there initially appears. There seem to be almost universally accepted moral principles like don't kill innocent people, don't lie, don't steal, and so on. And these principles may be implemented in different ways, which gives the appearance of significant moral diversity. For example, let's say we stumble across a cannibalistic culture. We're on some unexplored island in the Pacific, and there's a group of people who eat members of their own species. And so we might initially think, well, look, this group of culture doesn't share the value that we hold, that you shouldn't kill innocent people. But if you dig a little deeper, you might find out that when they choose to eat someone, it may be for ritualistic or for purposes of ritualistic purposes, or for purposes of revenge or something of that sort. And so that individual has lost the status of innocence, but they still could hold to the value that you shouldn't kill innocent people. It's just they have a different way of classifying people as innocent and non-innocent. So what's going on there is you have the same moral principle being implemented, but it's just being exemplified in a different way. So if that's a possibility, it may be the case that even the first premise of the cultural differences argument is false. It may be that when we do travel across all these different cultures and they seem to have so many different moral codes, that they are actually cultures holding to the same exact moral principles, but just implementing them in very different ways. Okay, so, but even if the cultural differences argument fails, it doesn't mean that we have completely defeated ethical relativism. It is possible that there could be other ways to argue for it, and there are other arguments that go beyond the scope of what we could do in this course. But there are a number of implications for accepting ethical relativism. Even if we were to say that it is true, we would have to countenance or accept a number of things that seem highly implausible to average people when it comes to trying to understand the nature of right and wrong. So one of those things we would have to accept would be that we can no longer critically evaluate the moral beliefs of other societies. We tend to believe that there is some universally valid moral truth, system of moral truths that applies to everyone, and that some societies just don't have it right. But if ethical relativism is true, we couldn't say that, for example, not giving access to education for females in Afghanistan is morally wrong. All we could say is that they have different cultural values. So if we accept ethical relativism, we couldn't critically evaluate the moral beliefs of other societies or individuals. Also, number two, if we can no longer critically evaluate the moral code of our own society, then obviously that would be radically different than how we've done things in the past. We tend to believe that we can critically evaluate our own moral code, and that's why we've seen changes in our moral structure. We've seen changes on views concerning the status of women, the status of minorities. So we've seen significant moral change throughout the history of our culture. But if we accept ethical relativism, we really couldn't critically evaluate the moral code of our own society. What makes that moral code the appropriate moral code is that the society has determined it. So you couldn't say it's the inappropriate moral code, because what makes it appropriate is its acceptance by the society. And then finally, if we accept ethical relativism, moral progress would be impossible. We tend to think that we are getting closer and closer to the correct moral belief system. So if you compare our beliefs to somebody 500 years ago, we tend to believe today that our moral system is a better moral system. We of course have setbacks, and we take wrong turns, but the general view is that we are capable of moral progress. But if you're an ethical relativist, if you subscribe to that view, there is no such thing as moral progress. The morally correct system is whatever is held at the time by the culture or the individual. And so if you switch to one that's logically opposite of what you hold to today, you haven't regressed morally. It's just you've accepted a different set of moral values. So there isn't really a concept of progress under the ethical relativist system. Okay, so that wraps up our lecture on ethical relativism. If you have any questions or concerns, don't hesitate to contact me. As always, you can get me via my email at philandersmith, lrow at philandersmith.edu. Thanks, and I'll see you on the next lecture.